Good evening, and welcome to the UCI Library's virtual event, Shakespeare's First Folio, How It Was Made. I'm John Renaud, Associate University Librarian for Research Resources. I'd like to start tonight's program with the UCI Library's acknowledgement of our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hashimin and Tongva peoples. The libraries are once again happy to co-sponsor this event with UCI Illuminations and the UCI New Swan Shakespeare Center. A special thank you to Professor Julia Lepton for your continued support of the libraries. More than 400 years after Shakespeare's death, his legacy continues. But how do we know Shakespeare? For many of his plays, the answer is in one book. Published in 1623, the First Folio is the first compilation of Shakespeare's plays, half of which had never been published before. A landmark of printing, 235 copies of the First Folio survive today, and they're considered among the most valuable printed books of all time. It is quite timely to discuss the folio tonight. You may have seen the breaking news this week of a copy of the First Folio that was sold at auction for just under $10 million. This established a new auction record for any printed book of literature. This is the first time in almost 2 decades a folio has been on the market. UCI's prize copy of the First Folio was donated to the UCI Libraries in 1986 by Patrick Hamrady, a proud UCI alumnus. UCI Library's copy of the First Folio is truly a treasure. We hope you'll enjoy this short clip showing how he acquired this rare book and why he donated it to the libraries.
Ah, this beautiful thing. Be amazed how the material of this book, how fine it is, how great it is. I mean, this is a book that doesn't stain easily or anything like that. And I was familiar with it when I was very young. I had seen this somewhere, I don't know where. But it wasn't until when I got to the point where I had my own company and I started to make a lot of money. And one day, a gentleman from Boston came in and said, hey, in LA, there's a copy, the First Folio is available. I said, I'll buy it. He said, it's going to be expensive. I said, I didn't care, I wanted it. And I did buy it. And over a period of a year, I was going to put it into a safe, and I said, no, I want people to see it. And I put it on a table in my office, but then I started to worry that people are going to pick it up and they're going to get dirty hands and all this kind of thing, and this was too precious. So I tried to figure out, okay, what would I really do with it that I think it's going to be used the way it should be? And then, aha, there's a fellow over there that runs, I guess he runs part of the information stuff here at the school. But anyway, I went over and I said, would you like a copy? Would you like to have my book? He said, yeah. I said, oh, okay, I'll bring it over. And I just put it in a briefcase and walked it over. And he said, oh my God, what are you doing? I said, well, this is it. And he said, yes, it is. And I was really kind of shocked that it was so rare for anyone to have, because I had one. So it can't be really that rare. Well, I finally did a little studying and I found out just how rare this is. And I was so happy because when I came over, I found, I used to come over quite a bit when I was actually working down 5 miles from here or so. And it was always out on display, in the library. And that's so neat, that people have a chance to see it. And so, that was really, to me, it was a gift to me that I could supply something like this.
Tonight's event will begin with a lecture from Andrea Mays. She is author of The Millionaire and the Bard and is a First Folio scholar. Tonight, we'll be exploring how the First Folio was made. You may submit questions during the lecture using the Q&A feature, and we'll have time for questions after the lecture. We will then welcome Derek Quesada, Outreach and Public Services Librarian for Special Collections and Archives, to present our rare and wonderful copy of Shakespeare's First Folio. During this time, we'll welcome you to ask questions about the First Folio before concluding tonight's event. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Mays. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that nice introduction, and welcome everybody to First Folio Friday, although it's Thursday. Tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the First Folio came about, how it was made. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have some artwork and some, whoops, that's not what I'm supposed to share with you. Hold on. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about how the First Folio came about as a publishing project and how all the pieces fit together. I always begin my First Folio Friday presentations with this slide, which is First Folio by the numbers. And the numbers are 900, 750, 235, 82, 13, and now 10 million. 900 is the number of pages in the volume. 750 is the number of copies we think were made in the print run of the First Folio. 235 is the number of surviving copies of Shakespeare's First Folio. 82 is the world's largest collection of First Folios. That's all in one building in Washington, D.C. at the Folger Library. 13 is the world's second largest collection of Shakespeare First Folios. That's in Meisei University in Japan. And the last number I had to change last night. So as John mentioned, yesterday, Christie's sold a very fine copy of Shakespeare's First Folio at just shy of $10 million. So Mr. Hanratty, that was a really good investment that you made. This is the book that saved Shakespeare, or at least half of his plays, from the ash heap of history. About half of Shakespeare's plays had been published before he died, but the others were in danger of disappearing because they had never been published. So had the First Folio not been published, probably half of those plays would have disappeared. What had been published by the time Shakespeare died were his long poems, his sonnets, and then 19 of his plays have been published in quarto form. And I'll talk about what a quarto is in a moment. None of these publications had been authorized by him. The plays were published without his agreement, without his editing, without his permission. And I've talked about that in a previous discussion. So look up my old talk if you want to hear about how that happened. Shakespeare died in 1616, and two of his friends, fellow actors, fellow shareholders in the Globe Theatre, John Hemings and Henry Condell, wanted to publish a collected volume of all of Shakespeare's plays as a tribute to their friend. This was going to be a memorial volume to honor their friend. This was not going to be an easy project, however. There was a lot that needed to be done. I have a slide here of a broadside of a play from 1598 that Shakespeare appeared in with his friends Condell and Hemings. So you'll see Will Shakespeare's name on the list of principal comedians, Henry Condell and John Hemings. So they knew each other, acted together, acted under the directorship of Shakespeare. They knew each other for a long time. In the preliminaries of the Shakespeare First Folio is a list of the names of principal actors, and there once again, William Shakespeare appears, but so do Hemings and Condell. These were good friends. What was their plan? They would assemble the sources they had at their disposal. They would contact publisher, arrange for the printing of the book, decide on the format of the book, organize the plays, edit them, arrange for some artwork, decide how large the print run would be, print the copies, and start selling. So what were the sources that would have been available to Hemings and Condell? First and foremost, Hemings and Condell would have available to them what no other publisher would have. Namely, they would have the prompt copies that were owned by the theater. As shareholders in the Globe Theater, they would have had access to these prompt copies, which would have been delivered to the theater, and this would have been the basis for the lines that the actors would have learned. A single prompt copy, and Hemings and Condell would have had access to any of them that survived. There were also the previously published plays that I mentioned, so 19 quarto editions, previously published. Some of them were in good shape, some of them were in not such good shape, and I've talked about that on previous occasions as well. There's one quarto edition that if that were the only one that had survived, we would not know the to be or not to be soliloquy because it was a word salad the way it was published. And then last but not least was the memories that Hemings and Condell would have of their time walking the boards with Shakespeare. They would know this is where someone entered, or at this point, the dog bites the actor's leg, or whatever the directions were. No, that's not how that line was. They would know, and they were in a unique position then to be able to edit these plays so that in the first folio, they appear as they had actually been acted at the time. So what did editing the plays entail? Some corrections to the quarto editions, editing of the prompt copies, comments about how the play had actually been performed. And they did something else that was unusual for publishing. And that was they were the ones that first introduced act and scene divisions into Shakespeare's published plays. So here is a page from a Hamlet quarto. And you'll notice there's no Act 1, Scene 1 designation there. It just says enter 2 sentinels, and there are no act and scene divisions whatsoever. When we get to the Shakespeare First Folio, we now have act and scene divisions. So those arrows point to, Act 1, Scene 1, and then Scene 2. Something we really take for granted in the published editions of the plays that we see now. We assume that they were always divided. No, that was Hemings and Condell. Second, they would line up an artist to engrave an image of their deceased friend. So the first thing I would ask is, what does Shakespeare look like? And how do you know that? And the answer to the question, the second question at least, is probably you know him from this image. So this is the engraving that Hemings and Condell commissioned to be made of their friend William Shakespeare. So a 24-year-old Flemish copper engraver named Martin Droeshout engraved this portrait of Shakespeare, not from life. Shakespeare was already deceased by the time this was underway, but he would have engraved this image, and then people who knew him, Hemings, Condell, Shakespeare's widow, Shakespeare's children, his son-in-law, etc., they would have known what he looked like, and they could have said, no, it didn't really look like him. So this is the image that we assume is true to life of William Shakespeare. Next question is how to arrange the play. So you've got 36 plays. How are you going to arrange them in the volume? Alphabetically, chronologically, and when they were last performed? How do you arrange them? Well, we are very familiar with their classification system now, and that is that they are listed as comedies, histories, and tragedies. But again, we kind of take that for granted that that's how the plays were divided up. Hemings and Condell came up with that scheme. You might also say, oh, of course, there's some plays that are comedies, there's some plays that are histories, there's some plays that are tragedies, but again, not so easy to classify all of the plays that way. For example, comedies typically end with a wedding, happiness. One play that is classified as a comedy that indeed ends with a wedding is Measure for Measure. I'm not sure all of us would classify that as a comedy. It's got some very serious themes. There's a lot of fear. There's threats of violence. It's themes of justice, but yet it's classified as a comedy. The histories are basically English history plays, a cycle of plays, but it does not include all of the historical characters that Shakespeare wrote about, nor does it even include all of the English kings. Cymbeline, King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar are all categorized as tragedies, not in the histories section. So again, they set up the classification system. Next, they had to decide what the format of the book was going to be. What was the size of the book going to be? So if you have a book that's a very large format paper, and it turns out to be 900 pages, imagine if instead you had made each of the pages the size of a paperback book. It would be a book maybe this thick, not that easy to carry around. So instead, they decided they would make this book in a folio format. So I've got a little artwork there to show you what a folio would look like, but I've also got a piece of paper here. So if you had a piece of paper like this and you put it into the printing press and you printed one page on each side, flip it over, print one on each side, and then you folded it once, that would be a folio size. It's a pretty large format paper. If you folded it one more time, then you would have a quarto size. So those first 19 plays that were published in a book about this size. That also leaves you with the problem that the tops of the pages are stuck together. So you would need a special knife like this gentleman on the picture has in his hand and to slice open the top of those pages. Now, a folio format had previously been reserved for mostly serious works, not mere entertainments like theater. They were political tracts, religious tracts, and so on. So the public was really not used to the idea of plays being taken seriously, and they were a little concerned that they might be mocked a little bit about using such a serious format for such a light entertainment. Next, they had to line up a publisher, somebody to print the book and then put it on sale. So they contracted with publishers William Jaggard and Edward Blunt, whose names appear, as you can see on the arrow, on the front page, on the title page of the Shakespeare First Folio, also appears at the end of the book under the printer's ornament there. And I've got a little close up on that so you can see the names of the printer publishers. So that's Jaggard and Blunt, Smithwick and Aspley, 1623. What else do they have to do? They have to line up blurbs. Any 21st century author who is publicizing their book is going to find friends of theirs to write blurbs about the book. Well, these are blurbs 17th century style. So Hemings and Condell wrote one long piece as a memorial to their friend. They also lined up other authors, including Ben Jonson, who wrote the first piece to appear in the prefatory matter. And this is from Ben Jonson to the reader. Hemings and Condell's piece, among other things, is flattering to their friend William Shakespeare, but it also implores the reader to buy the book. So a little bit of salesmanship in there too. The next step would be to set the type. And with a folio format, you would set 2 columns of type. So that folio, sorry, that quarto that I showed you earlier, that would be a single column of type. The folio format is going to be into 2 columns of type. Let me talk a little bit about the 17th century printing process. So first, the metal type pieces would be sorted into cases, uppercase and lowercase, which is of course where we get that terminology. Uppercase, lowercase would have been filled with the pieces of print, or sorry, of type. Here's a couple of type cases, an uppercase and a lowercase filled with pieces of type, ready for a compositor to put them together into words and lines of text, and then the lines assembled into a page of text, which would then be placed in the printing press. So here I have a few pictures of 17th century printing. So you have the compositors working with the print cases there. Here you have a print compositor who's got in his hand a stick into which each individual letter is put, and then the composed line is put into a frame, which is then put onto the printing press. So here is a printing press, very similar to the one that would have been used for printing Shakespeare's first folio. You see a print case, a type case in the back. You see in the front 2 gentlemen at the press. The press looks a little bit like a wine press or an olive press, very similar design in that you have a screw that one person would pull, which would then compress the paper against the type onto which ink had been applied. So the gentleman on the right has got 2 balls covered with sheepskin that were dipped in ink and then rolled around on the top of the type to cover all the typeface. The gentleman on the left would have had clean hands. So he only touched clean paper, not the ink. And he would be putting the piece of paper into the frame, which would then be pressed down by the printing press and the ink applied to the paper. They would then have hung those sheets that were wet with ink onto lines that were strung across the print shop and let them dry. Once they were dried, what did you do? You stacked them all together and you left them in a pile until all of the pages for a particular section of the book had been printed. While the pages were being printed, the first copy that came off the press would go to the editor, to a compositor who could read, and he would make corrections on the page. So he would mark corrections, omissions, changes in spelling, this letter is upside down, etc. Bring it back to the typesetter who would make any corrections on the fly and then continue to print those pages. So for each page, you have several pages that would have come off the press while the editing process was going on. Those are the uncorrected stage. Then you would have one copy, one page that would be the proofreader's page. Paper was too expensive and valuable just to chuck it away. So that would have been left in the pile along with the others to be collated into the final book. And then finally, you would have pages that were in the corrected state. Okay, so those are our uncorrected, one single proof copy, and then corrected pages that are in the stack of pages waiting to be collated. How do you collate them? When we're finished, there are 900 pages, 2 columns per page. Look something like this. Familiar? And then how do we assemble those pages? So imagine 900 pages and 750 copies. Lots and lots of paper spread around the print shop. And the answer is you take each page. In fact, you're going to take 6 of them and you're going to nest them one inside the other like that page looks there. And they become a little booklet. So again, you kind of collapse them into a little booklet. And then you have piles of these collated booklets sitting around the print shop. Now, there's one problem here. It looks pretty obvious how you assemble these pages because you know how to read. But the people who were assembling those pages into these little booklets called quires might not have been able to read. So they needed a device to be able to make sure that they were assembling the pages in the right order. And that device is called a catchword. So outside the text on the bottom right of the page that's on your right will be a word that is not connected to the text on that page. There's an example. I'll show you another in a moment. On the back of that page, at the top, the first word of the printed text would be that word. So you knew from page to page which pages to assemble and in what order by looking at the catchwords. That was how we knew, especially when you had illiterate compositors or people, boys working in the print shop who were doing the collating, that they were putting the pages in the right order. Here's another example. On the right with a green arrow, you see the word or. That's not related to the text on the bottom of the bottom line. And let him for a pair of kisses. The word or just appears there. And again, that will be the first word on the next page. And that way you'll be able to collate the quires correctly. The second thing that we need to know is, once you've got all these little booklets stacked up, stacks and stacks of these booklets that have got 6 pages in each of them, how do you know the order in which to put the booklets? So they needed another device, and that is what you see with the orange letter. The orange arrow, in which you see a signature PP2, which tells the compositor the order that that quire goes in relative to the other. So the first quire is going to have A's, the second quire is going to have B's, the third quire is going to have C's, and so on. And these little packets, these little booklets of 6 sheets are going to be assembled finally into one gigantic package. Stack up all of those booklets and they look like this. Again, we hope the compositors have been paying attention to the signatures. They will stitch those quires onto a piece of rope or piece of leather, sew them very carefully onto these pieces of rope. Generally, when you see this, what's facing us is the spine. If you bind that, and where those ropes are is where you would tend to see a bump on the spine. I'll show you that in a moment as well. Okay, so stitch the quires together onto a rope, and then they can be sold that way. It's called in sheets, or you can take them to your binder, and your binder could make a binder to your specifications, what color you like, the height that would fit into your bookshelves, bindings that would coordinate or match all of the other bindings in your library. So you could have had them bound yourself. This is a picture of the UC Irvine hand-writing copy of the first folio. And you can see that once the quires are stacked, you can sort of see that at the edge that these are stacked quires, and also that they're now sewn, in this case, to a binding. There is the binding of the copy that is at the UC Irvine Library. You can see a Moroccan maroon colored leather that has got gold tooling on it. You can see these vertical lines that are the bumps that appear where the quires were sewn together. Here is another view of that beautiful binding with the name Shakespeare embossed on the spine, and London 1623, the publication date. This binding dates to the 19th century. So whoever owned it at the time, either there was no cover, the binding was damaged, whatever. And then the owner in the 19th century would have had this recovered, dates to about that time. The last picture that I have in here of the hand-writing copy that's at UC Irvine is the last page of the book. And this is, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is. Okay, so this is the last page. which is what is one of the collectors called the Grand Leaves, a very valuable page because as the last copy in a very heavy book, a lot of these get torn out, they get destroyed, they get damaged, and this one is still there. Although it's repaired, it is still there, which makes it very desirable. And here we have another copy of this magnificent first folio, bound in leather, beautiful portrait, beautiful dedicatory verse from Ben Jonson. And that is the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea Mays, for this really enlightening seminar. I know that I enjoyed it greatly. Now we'll be opening to questions from the audience before taking a look at UCI Library's first folio. As this is happening, please continue to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. And my wonderful colleague, Carla Motley, will be facilitating the Q&A portion. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So the first question for you is, are there differences between the prompts and folio with interest or significance? Specifically, are there interesting differences in the text?
The answer is we don't know. Between the prompt copies and the first folio, we have no prompt copies. We have not a single word in Shakespeare's hand except his name that we know for sure. And we have no prompt copies. So we don't know. That's a good question, but we do not know the answer.
Thanks for that. Is there anything known about the material that the type was made of? Was it some kind of alloy or wood? What do you know about it?
Okay, it was definitely metal. So we have 1425, we have the first movable type press coming to England. And this was printed in England close to St. Paul's churchyard. So it was definitely metal type, not wood.
Were the uncorrected or editor-proof copies included in final folios for sale?
They were. And I checked, before I put together my presentation, I checked to find out if there was a proof page in the UC Irvine copy, but there isn't. But if you go to see another copy, you might, as you're flipping through the page, well, you're not going to be flipping through pages. As you're looking through the pages of the first folio, you might find one that's got, a line through something or a caret or, redirecting some text or correction in the spelling. So they're out there. There don't happen to be any of them in the copy that's at UC Irvine, but there is for super geeks, an inventory of the pages of every known copy of the Shakespeare first folio. So all 235 copies have been examined, and you can tell from that census which copies have those proof pages that the editor would have written on. So they're quite desirable. They're not that common. I'm sure lots of people, lots of these pages disappeared, period. But there's only one of those for each page that was printed. So there are 900 pages somewhere around, but sort of randomly distributed among the copies that are out there.
Great. Did they have to worry about rats chewing on the paper since the papers were left out to dry?
Not at that point. So they probably had cats in the printer's shop. So the cats would have kept the rats away, but rats did a terrible job on copies after they were published. So it maybe sometime in the future, I'll do a presentation on the enemies of the first folio. So what has caused most of their demises, but I've seen copies where, mice chewed at the ends, and many where bugs got into the paper, where pages had to be repaired, lots of water damage, some really interesting stories about fire damage. Some were burned. Some copies may have been burned during the Fire of London. We don't know exactly which ones, but other fires, including a copy that had been in New York, in Tarrytown, New York, and then when it was moved to Philadelphia, it burned down in an actor's home fire, and there's nothing left of it except a little stack of ashes about yay big, and I've seen them. They're in Philadelphia.
So this one is a two-part question.
Okay.
How many known works were lost? And are there any other images of Shakespeare for comparison to the folio image?
Let me answer the second one first, and Julia can help me with the first one. Do we have any other images? The only other image that was made of Shakespeare when someone who knew him was still alive is the effigy of Shakespeare at Stratford-upon-Avon. So if you go to Trinity Church at Stratford-upon-Avon, in the church above the crypt is the effigy that you might be familiar with what it looks like. That was commissioned by Shakespeare's son-in-law, who certainly would have known what Shakespeare looked like. And that's the only other image that we know for sure. So I am not an expert in portraiture. I know that every once in a while someone says, this is Shakespeare, that's Shakespeare. To my knowledge, it's the only two that we know for sure that were made during Shakespeare's time. The first question was, how many plays do we know of that we don't have copies of? So I would say Two Noble Kinsmen was one that's not in this volume. Pericles is one that's not in this volume, but that's for different reasons. That's because Hemings and Condell could not get permission from the publisher who had previously printed it to reproduce it in the volume. And then there's Cardenio. And Julia, you can tell me better what the state of Cardenio is. Cardenio is based on a character from Cervantes. Right. He's based on, it's as though you wrote, you took Gone with the Wind and you wrote an entire novel about Mr. Kennedy. Not the main character, but then he basically made up this great story around him. And Julia can pipe in here and tell me what the state of Cardenio is, how much of it we have. And
well, it was reconstructed in the 18th century by a Shakespearean editor named Tybalt. And it's now actually, there's an Arden edition of Cardenio. There's kind of a whole industry around Cardenio, kind of arguing that Tybalt's reconstruction was not a forgery, but was in fact authentic, but it's very controversial.
Right.
Another lost play is possibly Love's Labour's One.
Right. Although that might be something by the same title. It may be. It
could, so there's a lot we don't know. But the fact that Love's Labour's lost ends with a deferred wedding, deferred for a whole year, makes some scholars believe that there was at least intended a second play, but
I could see Shakespeare writing a cliffhanger, no problem with that.
Great. So when is this very valuable volume on display? And also, how is it stored? How does the UCI libraries keep it safe? And is it the most valuable volume owned by UCI? And I'm not sure if Derek maybe wants to join us for this part.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So the first folio is actually one of the few items that we keep in a bank vault. So if you imagine like Looney Tunes, big, enormous, impenetrable bank vault, that's what we have in special collections. And so the first folio, I think one of the Nobel prizes that we had won, one of the scientists, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, so it might have been Roland, who had won the Nobel Prize for detecting the ozone depletion, is in there. And then we have some random kind of like I'm not sure exactly what the history is, but some Ming vases that are in there. So you have the Ming vases, Nobel Prize, and then you have the first folio of Shakespeare. The area that we keep the vault in is actually climate controlled. So we have an HVAC system that keeps all of the temperature in a stable environment. And that's not just for the first folio, but also for all of our rare book materials. So apart from those two things, that's probably how most special collections approach it. I'm sure that the amount of first folios that you have accumulated warrants additional security measures. But for our copy, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I would just add to that. First, I want to go into that vault. Second is the first week that I did research at the Folger Shakespeare Library, I was allowed to go into the vault. And let me tell you, there are 82 copies of that, and then other books that are far more rare than the Shakespeare First Folio, like the only extant copy of the 1597 Titus Andronicus and Quarto, the only copy in the world. So if it had disappeared from Lund, Sweden, we would have had no copy but for the Shakespeare First Folio. Anyway, so yes, they take good care of it. They don't let me take it home on weekends or anything like that. So
yeah, I don't think it ever leaves the special collections, except for the first folio Fridays when we bring it downstairs.
This is a great question, kind of bouncing off of that. Does the library restrict the number of times a year that a folio is viewed?
So we don't. And I think that was behind the idea of Patrick Henry donating it to UC Irvine. I think that in his vision, or at least from the videos and the interviews that I've heard, he really wanted it to be seen as much as possible. So we don't necessarily have restrictions we don't have like a hard and fast number for the amount of times we can bring it out. But we do bring it out if it warrants the opportunity. So if we have a group of English majors as like a student organization coming in, I think the English Major Association, we'd be more than happy to bring it out for that occasion. First Folio Fridays, other events where some of the Shakespearean actors and actresses would come out and view that, we're more than happy to do that. I think on the average in non-COVID years, we have brought it out maybe 6 to 8 times per year.
can I add one little thing to that? And that is, it is quite a treasure to have one, to be able to see and I mean, get up close with it. And it's, you know, it's not behind bars. It's not behind plexi all the time. I mean, when Derek brings this out, you're right there with this thing. I did a presentation for a group in May. And at the end of the presentation, one of the members said, oh, we would like to take a field trip and go see a first folio. And they were in Florida. And I said, your closest copy is in Washington, D.C. So depending on where you live in the country, you might have to go a very long way to see a copy. And you've got one in your backyard here.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky in California. Looking at the survey of where the first folios are located, there's actually a really surprising number of first folios in California.
-1 as of yesterday. We don't know who the buyer is, but the one from Mills College is not in Mills College anymore.
Exactly. So even more reason why we're lucky to have our copy.
Exactly.
Talking about the Mills copy, we have a question here that is our copy, the UCI Library's copy, worth 10 million?
Ooh, hard to say. So if I had to guess yesterday, what this copy yesterday at auction would sell for, I would not have guessed 10 million. I would have guessed somewhere around 6. That was the previous record. So the previous record was 6.1 million for an absolutely spectacular copy with a very long provenance. So we knew who owned it for a very long time, same one of 2 people who owned it for a very long time. We're in COVID, although apparently collectors are not being bothered by that. So people are not attending the auctions, but this was a bid that was received on the phone. I would never have guessed 10 million. My bid was way below that. So I would not have guessed it would have. So the short answer is I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to do a comparison of that copy and the copy that's at UC Irvine. The one at UC Irvine is pretty complete. I don't know off the top of my head how many pages there might be missing, but it's in fine condition. The one at Mills, I think, had an old, a 17th century cover on it. That makes it a little more valuable. There are various other factors, but I'm sure the insurance company has their own guess.
I think just to emphasize, 10 million as a number is enormous. I think the idea of a $6 million book was mind-blowing, even in 2001 when that copy had sold. So I think apart from the Shakespeare First Folio, the only other book that had kind of warranted a price tag in the multi-millions was the Audubon's Birds of America. And I think that the folio was second to that in terms of price. So yeah, increase in an additional $4 plus $5 million is pretty extraordinary.
It seems that the print shops needed space, 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 and more space. How large were the print shops in general at that time?
Ooh. Well, the print shop where this one was made is about a block long in London. A block long? So big, not huge. We know, for example, that it wasn't large. It wasn't like a Kinko's where you had 500 machines going. You might have had one machine that was working on several projects at the same time. So we know, for example, it took a total of 2 years to print the first folio before, from the time you set the first page until it went on sale is 2 years, which means they were working other projects in between. And one of the ways we know this is if you look at some other folios that were printed at the same time. So folio format books that were printed around the same time by Jaggard. You'll see often a ghost image on a page where, they took a page off and there was a little bit of ink left on there that transferred from one book to the other. So I've seen that a few times. So they were not enormous, not like a Quonset hut full. I don't know if that helps. And most of them were right around St. Paul's Cathedral in that area.
When was the last time a missing first folio was discovered?
In Saint-Omer in France. And was that last year or the year before? I can't remember. I think it's last year. And there's another one that is, I don't know if it's real yet. We'll find out if it's authenticated, but that's the last one I know of. Julia, do you know of a more recent one? No. I think Saint-Omer was the last one.
Yeah, I think that 2014 is in Saint-Omer. So it's a while ago now. I don't think anything's been discovered since then.
I know there's one other copy that is in the process of being examined for authentication.
Oh, very interesting.
Thank you for that. What are the measurements of the folio pages?
Oh, that's a really good question. And the answer is, it depends. You can look it up in this census that I mentioned before, because along with keeping track of where the corrected copy pages and where the proof pages are, they also measured every copy. So here's the idea. You start with a page that's this big and you cover it. And if you don't trim the pages at all, so this would be deckled edges everywhere here. And if you don't plane them, then it's full size with the deckled edges. But let's say you have a bookshelf and it doesn't quite fit in the bookshelf. People would actually cut down the tops of the pages, trim the top and the bottom so that, yes, that's better. That fits into my bookcase now. So there are copies that are different sizes. And in fact, that's one of the things that collectors look for is they want a tall copy is what the word that they use. But if you'll open, for example, a a copy of a first folio, and you can see that the gutters, sorry, the margins at the top are very small. Sometimes they're so small that they interfere with a line that is around the text, or they may even interfere with the text. So the answer is, it depends on how butchered the copy is and whether it was trimmed or not.
Thank you. And as we want to make sure there is time to actually view UCI Library's copy of the first folio, this will be our last question, but we will also have a Q&A session after we view the folio. So this will be the last question for now. How much would a first folio cost at the time of printing, and who would have the customer been to purchase the first folios?
So there are 3 different prices, but it would have cost you about a year's wages if you were a baker. So £1 without a binding. And then you could have gotten it with a vellum binding or a animal skin binding at different prices. So, but it would, Peter Blaney did a study looking at not just what the price was, because £1 doesn't sound too bad. That's like what you would pay for a Cadbury's chocolate bar now. But it would have been a year's wages for a baker. So the literacy rates were not exceptionally high. And basically, you were looking at people who are very well educated, nobles, collectors. Yeah, probably not a lot of bakers. Probably not a lot of actors either, although some actors later did acquire them.
Thank you so much. And now we will invite John back up to introduce our librarian to share the folio.
And thank you all for your great questions. And again, thank you, Andrea Mays. Please join me again in welcoming Derek Casada, Outreach and Public Services Librarian from the Special Collections and Archives, to present UCI's copy of Shakespeare's First Folio. Derek will provide an overview of UCI's copy and will also answer questions from the audience. Please continue to submit your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen so we can continue to moderate questions from you all, and hopefully we'll be able to answer any of the questions we didn't get to before. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, I just need someone to re-enable my video. Okay, there we go. All right, so everyone's getting 2 screens right now, hopefully. So I just want to say I'm very happy to be back in the reading room of UCI Library Special Collections and Archives with the first folio. And although, of course, it's very preferable to see the first folio in person, sharing the folio remotely will hopefully allow everyone an unobstructed view of the jewel of our collection, and also a chance to ask any of those additional burning questions that you may have, or simply maybe request to see your favorite play or a certain feature of the book that Andrea Mays has brought up in her lecture. So if you do have any questions, I want to continue to encourage you to submit those in the Q&A, and Carlin will start fielding those to me just momentarily. But so it's kind of an odd 15 minutes that we have, but I basically just want to pretend that what we're doing is something that my wife calls sobremesa. So it's our time at the dinner table after the meal, really a chance to kind of talk and digest and revel in Andrea Mays' talk that she just gave. And just a chance for me to walk through the folio and show you some of the features that she had pointed out and discuss them a little further. So without further ado, you should see UCI's copy, the Patrick Henry copy of the first folio in front of you. So as Andrea pointed out, our first folio copy actually has what's called a red or burgundy Morocco cover. And this is actually goat skin. It's known for its suppleness and also for this kind of pebble texture that you can see here. It's kind of a signature of a prestigious copy. But what's interesting, and this kind of goes to what Andrea was talking about, in terms of the folio really being this kind of living thing. So it doesn't stop. After it's printed, it continues to have a life of its own. So the Shakespearean copy that we have, as she mentioned, was actually rebound sometime in the 1800s. And so that's where you get this wonderful feature on the cover. On the interior, you have marbled end papers here, which actually attaches the binding to the kind of text block that makes up the core of the first folio. And marbling is something, again, another kind of prestigious gesture. What you're starting to notice are these little details that I think are interesting about the ownership of the first folio. Before Patrick Henry owned the copy, we really don't know much about the provenance or the kind of the ownership of our first folio. He bought it from Heritage Bookstore in Los Angeles at some point. Before that, it was probably sold by a book dealer. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he worked out of New York. And then before that, it's a complete mystery. So undoubtedly, this removed bookplate wasn't something that Patrick Henry probably put in. It was probably a previous owner before that and removed actually when it was sold to Heritage Bookstore. So I'll just get to kind of the main pages that I'm sure everyone wants to see and then just check on the questions. You'll notice that you have these fly paper, and this is kind of a different paper. This is, again, probably something that came with that 18th, 19th century binding. And then, of course, you have what everyone has come to recognize as the really notable pages that make up their image of what the first folio is, and that is the engraving of Shakespeare on the title page with the actual title of the first folio. So I think we constantly refer to it as the first folio, but really it is Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, again, is that actual title. And then on your left-hand side, you have that dedication, or basically a call out to the reader by playwright, kind of friendly rival of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson. What's, again, interesting about this copy is that, and this kind of talks about the idea of damage and worth and other things, is that our copy has as a facsimile the Ben Jonson to the reader dedication, as well as the engraving and title page. So facsimile means that it's a reproduction made to look like the original. So these aren't necessarily the original copies, and I'm pretty sure according to the Rasmussen and West, these are the only copies or the only pages that are missing from our first folio. So at some point in the history of our first folio, they were either damaged, destroyed, or probably cut out and kept. Maybe even hung at some point. But the Ben Jonson dedication is really interesting because it was actually done by hand. So instead of going and printing a new copy, they actually hired someone, whoever commissioned for this to happen, hired someone to do calligraphy and write in by hand, freehand, the same dedication. And then on the left, or I'm sorry, on your right-hand side, you have the engraving, which probably came from a later facsimile copy of Shakespeare. And so what you can see, or hopefully you can see this now, you notice that you have where this particular facsimile copy was laid into the page and then attached. So you can see the difference in the paper quality right there. So I just want to check and see if we have any questions here.
Thanks, Derek. We certainly do. And this question has been asked a couple times, and I'm sure this is a common question for you. A lot of attendees are noticing that you're not wearing gloves. Is that not necessary?
Yes.
Why aren't you wearing gloves when you're handling this precious treasure of the first folio?
Yes, so that is a question I receive almost every single time I do this demonstration. The reason is for my ability to feel the pages and not accidentally tear it. So if you'll notice, we do have a lovely little tear at the bottom of this page. I suspect that this paper is a different quality than the original text block of the first folio, which was, as maybe Andrea mentioned this before, but paper was really expensive in Shakespeare's time. It was made of cotton that was accumulated from rags, usually collected by rag collectors, and then processed, and you would get this really good, durable paper. It's very distinct. You can see how white it is and fresh than this. And I think this is later, so it probably uses a lesser quality paper, a little bit more brittle. But anyways, getting back to this idea of gloves and tactility, when I'm wearing gloves, or when you are wearing gloves, you might accidentally rip. And that's just because you can't feel the pages as well. Also, the other thing is that the little threads in the gloves themselves can catch along those kind of uneven edges and then tear the page as well. So because we bring it out so infrequently and it's not being handled constantly, you actually can use your hands as long as they're clean, washed, and not extra oily. So hopefully that's the case for me. I do try and roll up my sleeves for the same reason that I don't catch the edges of the pages.
This might be the most fun question of the evening. What do folios smell like?
So they have a very distinct smell. And I think that most rare books that we have from a certain age, around the 1600s, the late 1500s, it has a smell to me that reminds me a little bit of like an old sagebrush mixed with a little bit of maple syrup. And maybe I'm over romanticizing it, but that's how it smells to me. And it's funny because as I was setting up, we actually had a library assistant who was in here earlier. We're all masked up, but he wanted to pass by and he had that same question. He wanted to know what it smelled like. So I asked him to go ahead and take a whiff, and he was pleasantly surprised by it. So if you do get a chance and we are able to bring this again out to the public, I would really encourage people to take a smell and see if it kind of aligns with my envisioning of it.
Great. Can you comment on the font choice for the folio?
The font choice I can't, and it's actually interesting because I was doing a little preparation for this because I wanted to bring some new facts about the first folio. I do have references completely non sequitur to its use while a person was reading and eating and spilling things. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was a type, but I never got to it. So I'm not sure if Julia or Andrea could talk about maybe the type that was selected or used.
I don't know about the
No.
particular font. I mean, obviously there's italic and Roman, but beyond that, I don't know. Andrea, do you know more about the type that was chosen?
No, I don't know anything. Whoops. The host has stopped my video. Okay. I don't know anything else about the choice of type, but I can tell you that the printer would not have had as many choices of font as we do, thanks to Steve Jobs, because the type would wear out and then you'd have to replace it. So, imagine you're using this to print and then you have to get replace all of the letters one at a time. You didn't have choices of a lot of different fonts.
Yeah, and that's something that I picked up in some of the reading about the first folio was that there's notification. So in the surveys of the first folios, they'll take note of things like damage type. And that's
right.
That's a clue where they can understand which folios might have been printed in which order, because you can follow the clues of a particular type that was reused and its progressive damage over time. So there are little indications in this book, and I should show people what we've referred to a few times. And this is a really extensive survey of every little detail about every little first folio. So it's a wealth of information, but it details those things like the various keywords and catchwords, the quires, and then also things like damage type. So I wish I had a better answer for whoever asked that question out there, but it's worth investigating in the future.
Speaking of type, are there any other typographical errors in the folio?
Lots of them. Lots and lots and lots of them. In fact, when I talked about corrections that were made on the fly, there are lines from Shakespeare that are misprinted in some copies. So the uncorrected copy, for example, this is a line out of Othello. Amelia is in the closet with Desdemona. Desdemona is getting undressed for bed. And Amelia is talking to her about a gentleman. And she says, I know a woman who would have walked to Palestine on her knees for a kiss of his neither lip. Oops, no, not neither. That was corrected. It's nether, yeah. But there's some copies that say neither lip. Oh no, wrong one. So yes, they're actually books that are written about what are the differences between the copies, what was corrected, what was not corrected, are there differences? And the differences are there, but they're more like goofs and not like in one copy, Hamlet knows that it's Polonius behind the arras, and the other copy he doesn't. It's nothing major like that.
And maybe, I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but this is what I remember reading, is that the printers were actually proofreading to a certain extent as they were printing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So they would print, pull off a sheet to bring to the proofreader, and they would keep printing while that was going on. And as the proofreader was making the corrections, then they would stop the press, correct the type, and continue. Yeah, so it was on the fly, which means you have random numbers of uncorrected and corrected pages for each page.
And I just wanted to show this one kind of spread. I'm not sure how well it comes through, but I was just flipping through the folio, and I'm lucky to be able to have that privilege, just kind of flip through it at leisure. But I did notice that there's a lot of, it looks like the rules and also the transfer of the type, it doesn't look like it came through correctly. And there's some places where the ink doesn't seem to have applied evenly, or the ink was a little too blotted and it looks like it kind of bleeds through the paper. So whether they applied too much pressure or not enough, it looks like there's places where there's lots of these little errors that appear.
If there's too much ink, I think it's called a monk. And if there's too little ink, it's called a bishop. So
Interesting.
they actually, I mean, this happens where, for example, they applied too much ink and all the holes in all the letters are filled in. So there you go.
Thank you. Does UCI bid on items for sale like additional copies of the first folio, or do they rely on donors to add to the collection?
In terms of rare books, we rely almost exclusively on donations. We have bought some older books in the past. We have a small budget that is probably going to get a little smaller realistically. And we will occasionally buy things that really align with our collection. But for the most part, our rare book collection comes primarily from donors. So that's why we have a British naval history rare book collection as a part of our general collection. But something like on the scale of the first folio or a quarto or anything like these would probably be well outside of our means as a public institution. So this is where it falls into the hands of private, wealthy collectors, book dealers, or private institutions. But we would love to. So if you have a quarto out there, please talk to Carlin or talk to other people on our staff.
Thanks, Derek. Will you please show the hidden page stamps this person wrote in, and they're not sure if that's the correct wording?
I'm wondering if you're thinking about the watermarks of the book or on the various pages. So I'm sure it got brought up at a certain point, but there are watermarks, which are essentially kind of like logos or crests that indicate the paper mill from which the paper came from. So if we could find one, usually you can highlight that by just holding up the phone behind it and shining it through. And then usually an image, I think all the ones that we have are an image of a crown would come through. The problem is that my phone is what I am speaking to right now, and I don't have a light that would be able to illuminate behind it. I know that even though the title page is a facsimile, it comes from a paper mill that does have a watermark, so that there is a watermark in here, but sadly, I don't have a light to shine through.
From what time period does the Ben Jonson and Shakespeare engraving date?
So the Ben Jonson engraving, for the dedication and then the engraving. Well, the engraving is coming from around the time that the first folio was produced. I imagine maybe a few years before it was published. I'm not really sure about the timeline from when Martin Drusout was working.
Yeah.
Drusout. It's a name that I've been working on for years. Drusout. I'm not sure how long he was working on the engraving during that time period. I'd imagine it'll probably be around 1620, 21. maybe during that 2-year time period when they're printing the book. The one interesting thing that I can tell you a little bit about the engraving is that Martin was actually tasked with going back and updating it. So again, this goes to this idea that the first folio was there's never complete first folio. There's various stages of the first folio and a variety of, so it is printed with errors, then those errors are corrected, then new errors appear. With the engraving, my understanding was that because he was not working from a live image, he was possibly also working from a portrait. And there's this idea that the portrait was only of his head. So you get a really good 3-dimensional image for his head, but then you have this very flat background for his body, because essentially Martin just kind of made it up. My understanding is that the very first issues of the engraving did not have the shadow around the collar. So that kind of added to this flatness of the body. And so he actually came back and he's working with a copper, a brass plate, and he's adding additional lines in the collar, cutting into that block of metal to add that additional 3-dimensionality through a shadow. And that he had done this maybe a few other times in that first printing of the folio, and then maybe in subsequent printings in the second folio or the third folio. Am I accurate on that?
You're good. So
Okay.
the engraving is done on copper, which is very soft. So as you're making lots and lots of copies, essentially the copper flattens out, and then the engraver comes back and recarves, and then maybe changes a thing or two, makes the shadow so he doesn't quite look like a head on a turkey platter. He a little more engraving. But basically you have, in different copies, you have different states of the portrait, depending on how early in the print run that copy was made.
And I think it's interesting to note that the engraving was commissioned specifically for the first folio, but it's not the only illustration that's in the folio. You'll notice that there are these kind of like little banner images at the beginning of The Tempest, at the end, the finis for the various plays. There's these little wood engravings. And when I first came to the first folio, I thought that they were unique. I thought maybe they were commissioned to capture elements of the flora and fauna of the New World and all this wish-wash. They're just recycled. I've actually seen the exact same woodcuts, and they're woodcuts, which is a cheaper to produce thing. It doesn't give you the sort of fidelity that you might get with a copper engraving that uses metal, requires additional skill. So you would just get, the printers would just have these on hand and use it as just decoration. So I've actually seen this very same wood engraving in other collections, other items in our rare book collection. So it's not special in any sort of way. It's just an additional little frill to add some panache to the place.
Can you please show a title page from one of the plays?
Absolutely. So I'll make my way over to The Tempest, because it's easy. Oops, here's the catalog. We should show the catalog too. So here's The Tempest. And it reuses that same little motif. It's just kind of punctuating throughout. This is something that I noticed about our folio, and maybe I'll just talk very briefly about this, is that our first folio, I think, is really unique in that it achieved, or it actually demanded a lot of restoration. It demanded a lot of kind of like updates and fixing, because apparently whenever it was purchased and this new kind of binding was added to it, the facsimile images were added to it, it was probably in a pretty sorry state. So in the Rasmussen and West survey, it actually makes a point of highlighting all of the re-inks that were done to the rules. And this is partially because the margins were really severely damaged. And this goes throughout the entire book. So you can actually kind of see this along the sides here, that this was actually added to fix the pages so that they're all even. And this goes throughout the book. So I imagine that there was a lot of work and actually probably a lot of labor involved in bringing this folio to the kind of condition that it is now. I'm just so interested in why that was. You know, for the first 100, 200 years after the first folio was printed, it really seemed like someone had our copy as a reading copy. It didn't seem like it was taken with any sort of care that we might take care of it now. And you imagine if that you're well off, you really enjoy Shakespeare's plays, you would be reading it for pleasure, not necessarily have it as a prestige object, although I'm sure many people did. To kind of punctuate that point, Andrea pointed something out to me that I want to share with everyone. And let me see if I can find this here. So what we have actually is, at some point, an owner of the first folio, and hopefully you'll be able to see this, used a pair of scissors to act as basically a bookmark in the first folio. And they left it there for a considerable amount of time. And over time, those scissors ended up rusting, and they actually rusted straight through. Oops, let me read this up. Straight through the entirety of these pages here. So you can see the handle marks of the scissors, but it kind of goes to suggest that this necessarily wasn't for prestige copy. If they're leaving scissors in it, it was much more of a reading copy. And kind of to get to that point as well, our copy also has a lot of wonderful grease stains. So if you can see off to the side here, these are fingerprints. They're grease fingerprints. So the person that was reading this was eating, most likely, some sort of savory meat, and just flipping through and enjoying reading their first folio copy. A few more stains here that you can see. Along here, likely grease stains. And then, which is probably one of my favorites, is that it looks like they spilled wine on the pages that they're reading, and then made a kind of half-hearted attempt to smudge it out and just kind of mashed it into the page itself. So this is considered in the Rasmussen and West survey as a mystery stain, possible wine.
Thank you. And now we have time for one last question. Do you have any idea what the shelf life is of the folio before it starts noticeably degrading?
It would depend all on the condition, the climate that it was kept in. So this is another thing that Andrea brought up that I thought was really interesting. I love this idea of the enemies of the folio, the first folio, right? So, I mean, part of that would be if the binding wasn't what it was, it would be in a very different shape. So if it was originally issued in the kind of like basic paper wrappers, and it was just put on a shelf somewhere, I don't think that it would last very long, maybe 100, 200 years tops. It would slowly disintegrate. Part of the reason you have a binding like this is to protect the interior of the text. And you also notice that too with the pages that are towards the front of the book, the ones that are open more frequently, they look in worse condition because they're being exposed to the sun and to the elements more frequently. So that's going to impact those pages over time. The interior of the book, as you can see, is pretty crisp, pretty clean, and really pliable and flexible. So the folio so far, in a variety of states, in a variety of different time periods and different conditions, people treating it with care, people not. It's lasted over 400 years. I imagine it's probably got another couple hundred years in it. I think that maybe others might want to take a stab at that.
I'll take a stab at it. That now with a $10 million price tag, people will be taking even more excellent care of their copies.
Absolutely. Let me just take it back.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions this evening. And now we'd like to invite John back up. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and again, thank you again so much, Derek, and again, thank you to Andrea and Julia for helping out with during this portion of Q&A as well. At this point, I'd like to invite a special friend of the libraries, Lynn Ramsey, to discuss why she supports programs like this at the UCI libraries. And again, thank you so much for speaking with us, Lynn, as well.
Thank you. I'm so happy to have a moment to share with you a little about a special group that I belong to, and it's the UCI Libraries Gateway Society. And if you care about the library and its collections and its services to students and the great programs like this one, that it shares with our community, this is one organization that you have to be a part of. The Gateway Society, we help make programs like this one possible, as well as helping fund new collections and technologies. And making an annual donation to the UCI Library at a level that works for you is what makes all of this that we just saw this evening possible. An individual like myself, I join at $150 a year. But if you're a UCI faculty member or staff, it's only $75. And recent alumni, it's only $50 for you. Current students, you can support the entity that cares about you for only $25 a year. My gift to the UCI Library is just one part, because in return, I get invitations to exhibit openings, author events, and a lot of behind the scenes information. So it's important right now to help take care of what's important to us. So please make a donation at the UCI Library website, or call them and ask for a brochure. It's one of the best and most appreciated gifts I've ever given. You know the staff, you know the collections, so make your gift to the UCI Gateway Society today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for your continued support of the libraries and for sharing that wonderful information with us this evening. Thank you so much. Again, for the rest of the audience, we really hope that you've enjoyed tonight's program, and we'll hope you'll join us at future UCI Libraries events. These events are a great opportunity for us to showcase the true gems of our collection, like the first folio. Our next virtual event, From I Ching to Manga, UCI's East Asian collection celebrating 30 years, will take place on November 18th at 5:30. This event will highlight our Chinese, Korean, and Japanese language collections. This will be an exciting event. We'll be having a conversation with Yang Chen, who is a professor of history here at UCI. He's Assistant Dean of Curriculum and Student Services and the School of the Humanities, and he's author of Chop Suey USA, The Story of Chinese Food in America. If this event were taking place at the libraries, at this point, we'd invite you to join us for reception. In the last few years, there's been tea that's very sort of English fest. But tonight, we have a special opportunity to invite you to join us for a Zoom meet and greet to virtually network, connect, and to learn more about the UCI libraries. If you'd like to join us, please click on the information in the chat to open the meet and greet Zoom meeting. This was also in your, if you have trouble with the chat, it was also in the confirmation email. And again, we really appreciate your joining us this evening. If you'd like to support the libraries, as Lynn was saying, you can also, and would like to learn more about our programs or are interested in becoming a member of the UCI Libraries Gateway Society, the web address, which may be in the chat as well, it's www.lib.uci.edu/gateway. And again, we can also, if you contact us, we're more than happy to send you information. And we really, again, this has been a great group, wonderful questions, and wishing you a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.